Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq, with daily insight on the Nasdaq-100 index, or the NDX, which is made up of 100 of the largest domestic and international non-financial innovative companies listed right here on the Nasdaq stock market. The NDX has been the barometer for U.S. large cap growth and also one of the best performing indexes over the last decade and a half, not to mention one of the most liquid index ecosystems in the world. Joining me is Nicholas Kalivas. He is a senior equity ETF strategist at Invesco to discuss weekly trends in the Nasdaq-100. And Nick, it appears investors took some profits ahead of earnings this week.
Yeah, they really did. I mean, we've had a nice run up here. And if you look at what happened, the Nasdaq-100 was a bit softer than the general market. And I would just chalk it up to people positioning for profits, because when you look at the macro news, there wasn't a whole lot there. We had, kind of better than expected news. If you look at the PMI numbers, look at durable good orders, but unemployment claims were weak, and there just wasn't a lot of punch there. I think a lot of people were waiting to see what was going to happen with the stimulus out of Washington and what that relief package might look like. And so when they looked at some of the market conditions, I think they were focused on earnings, and we saw that a little bit with Texas Instruments. It had a pretty strong beat on the 21st. The earnings were about 69% above estimate, but investors looked kind of deep into the report. They worried about inventory, so we got some profit taking. There's a similar story with Microsoft. Good earnings report, about 7% ahead of the estimate, $1.5 billion sales beat, but sold off on disappointment over cloud revenue. And I would say even the same thing happened with Tesla. Had very solid earnings relative to expectations, free cash flow surprise, but again, got some profit taking there. So we've seen a lot of the market leaders like the Amazons, the Apples, the Facebooks really trade sideways since mid-July. And I think that's kind of people just kind of positioning for profits. And of course, tomorrow, we're going to see a number of reports out, and I think that will help set the tone over the next week.
Let's take a look at some of the sectors that are weighing on the Nasdaq-100.
Yeah, so when we look at attribution, what we saw was really technology and consumer discretionary be the biggest drags, and that was probably coming a little bit from Intel's disappointment, some profit taking in Apple. When you dig into consumer discretionary, Tesla and Amazon were relative negatives when you look at attribution against the S&P 500. If there was a silver lining, the lack of exposure to financials, the lack of exposure to energy, that was a bit constructive.
And if we drill down either further to the constituents with positive and negative attribution, we can see on this chart here, we have a side-by-side of what's been adding and what's led to a little bit of the declines.
Yeah, so when we look at what did well, really AMD stood out last week. They were the beneficiary of Intel's kind of missteps in terms of execution. But it's also interesting, a lot of the more defensive names popped up in terms of positive contributions, like Pepsi, Mondelez, Kraft. Intuitive Surgical had another pretty good week after the week prior when J&J delayed its robotics program. I would say, when you see the drags there, you can see Intel, that misstep, you can see the Microsoft disappointment or the setback there, and then some of the profit taking in what has been kind of the leaders of the market, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Teslas, the Alphabets, those were all essentially pretty heavy.
And let's wrap up, Nick, with the semiconductors within the QQQ. Usually when we talk about the haves and the have-nots, you're looking at the retail space, but with the semis, it's pretty discernible what's working and what's not.
Yeah, it's really, it's pretty interesting here. I thought when you look at what's going on, and it really highlights a couple of positives of owning the QQQ. You can see that Intel has really lagged here. AMD has, in contrast, been a beneficiary, and even NVIDIA has had a great year. And in fact, NVIDIA was able to become the largest semiconductor name within the Qs after last week's misstep by Intel. I do think it is interesting when you think about diversification and kind of playing the trends. The Qs really allow you to do that. And one of the interesting takeaways, I think, from last week was that even though Intel had its misstep, NVIDIA and AMD have done quite well. And if you put both of those together, they actually have a larger weight than Intel in the index. And I think it really helps the investor kind of, stay with the trends, exploit the trends, and not be so worried about what's happening in an individual name.
All right, Nick, as always, thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.